The total annual amount of electronics products that Japan currently exports is approximately 10 trillion 50 billion yen. Vast amounts of semiconductors are used in all of them. Japan began to pursue the lead of the United States in this field from amidst post-war hunger and became the world's #1 producer of germanium transistors in 1959. However, the U.S. had advanced to where it was replacing germanium with silicon, into which even electronic circuits were being fabricated. In 1962, Japanese Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda, who was visiting Europe, was criticized as being a transistor salesman by French President Charles de Gaulle. This scene shows the recruitment of female factory workers who were called transistor girls. The 3 requisites for passing the aptitude test were good eyes, dexterous hands, and perseverance. Patient girls from farming villages were hired in large numbers. After intense education and training, the girls worked on the assembly lines. Each company tried to secure and educate outstanding transistor girls. At the time, this was the shortcut to winning the war of yields. Despite the quality of the fingertips and the perseverance of their employees, manufacturing yields weren't satisfactory.
I went to report to the department chief that yesterday the yield was 0.3%. In other words, just 3 out of 1,000 were good. The remainder were all inferior products. In fact, in my heart, I was hoping that I wouldn't have to report 0% tomorrow. There couldn't be a worse yield than 0%, a nightmare for a manager.
That the semiconductor industry was equated to fishing is because you don't know how many fish there are unless you cast your net. That it was also equated to farming is that the crop is bad if the weather is bad. The crop yield is poor, especially when the temperature and humidity are high in summer.
The drawbacks with germanium transistors were that they were easily damaged by moisture, humidity, and heat, and they degraded and stopped working, thus creating frequent problems.
One of the most dangerous threats to our nation's security is the possibility of attack by high-speed enemy bombers armed with nuclear weapons. These bombers can strike at supersonic speeds from many directions and altitudes to confuse our defense and delay the dispatch of interceptor weapons. In a mass raid, high-speed bombers could be in on us before we could determine their tracks. And then it would be too late to act.
The poor characteristics of the transistors used in military computers were a big problem. Amid the Cold War standoff between the United States and the USSR, the search for a stable material to replace germanium was an urgent task for the United States. Silicon is not highly sensitive to heat, and unlike germanium, which is a scarce resource, it is found everywhere. Bell Laboratories, where scientists were struggling to develop a silicon transistor, was the center of this research. In order to compensate for the shortcomings of silicon, it being highly active, various advances such as the method of covering it with an oxide film were made here. Carl Frosch and Lincoln Derrick thought the only way to handle silicon was to cover the surface with a protective film, and so looked for a material to make a strong film to bond with the silicon. Initially, they excluded only oxygen. They thought if they were to use oxygen, which easily synthesizes with other materials, then oxidation would not stop at the surface, but would completely permeate the silicon. But the bonding of oxygen to silicon became the key to using it. This chance discovery happened when a valve broke accidentally.
I don't think we knew at that time. I don't think we really knew. Yes, he knew it was big, but I don't think anybody at that particular, say, month or two realized how big it really could or would be developed into. Because later on, of course, Bell Labs did write up that that was one of the, should we say, cornerstones in all integrated circuitry. Without that, you couldn't make it. You couldn't make a circuit.
AT&T, which foresaw the coming age of communication satellites, vigorously pursued research on solar batteries. The work of Calvin Fuller and his associates was among the most significant at that time. Fuller discovered the gas phase diffusion method. This would eventually lead to a turning point in semiconductor technology and brought about today's semiconductor industry. In the meantime, a firm in Japan anticipated the switchover from germanium to silicon and aimed to manufacture highly pure silicon. Located at Yokkaichi City Harbor in Mie Prefecture is High Silicon Company, a refiner of silicon for semiconductor use. With a monthly production of 90 tons, it is the world's #1 producer. This is metallic silicon in powdered form shipped from Norway. It's 98% pure. It is placed inside a tank, melted with chloride, and turned into silicon chloride gas, which is then sent to a distillation tower. While the gas is continuously circulated, the impurities are gradually removed until the gas becomes highly purified with a negligible impurity content of 1 part per 100 billion. This gas is then reverted into a solid state. This is a giant electric cauldron for making solid silicon out of the silicon gas. The technicians set approximately 100 silicon seed rods, which are cut out from manufactured products. Electricity is passed through the seed rods, while the silicon gas is continuously circulated for a full 5 days. During this time, the seed rods grow to a thickness of about 10 centimeters. This work has never been shown before, even to people involved with the semiconductor industry. This process is a Japanese technology that was independently developed about 30 years ago. High Silicon is a subsidiary that branched off from the Chiso Corporation of Kumamoto Prefecture. When it developed this technology, Chiso was called New Japan Nitrogen Fertilizer Company. Before the war, the company had a factory overseas. After, it hired a large number of repatriates and was struggling to find new work. Company executives therefore decided to get involved with silicon, which they thought would probably replace germanium.
The purity of silicon has to be 9 to the 10th or 11th power. It's useless if the purity figure isn't at these high levels. However, at this time, we didn't know how to achieve a purity of this strict standard.
Their only clue was a rumor that DuPont in the United States had used silicon tetrachloride. In 1956, an experimental furnace was built at the Minamata plant. This experimental furnace is a recreation of the original model. Low-grade silicon is melted with hydrochloric acid, turning it into a gas and sent to the furnace, into which hydrogen is circulated. The silicon separates and sticks to the inside.
After that, we injected an inert gas that wouldn't explode and gradually replaced the hydrogen with it. But when we opened the furnace lid, it exploded. Bam!
There was an error in the design, and the hydrogen had accumulated. Though these explosions repeated, they gradually raised the purity of the silicon in this furnace. In 1958, they began to build a factory in Chiba Prefecture on land that had been part of a pine forest. The land price was cheap, and there was not much dust or dirt in the air. They built a quartz furnace and began their initial production at the end of 1959. Everyone watched with bated breath to see if it would work. It did. Inside the quartz tube, ultra-pure polycrystal silicon began to densely grow. The polycrystal silicon that they manufactured to a purity of 10 to the 9th power was remade into single crystal silicon using independently developed machinery. They cut the silicon and measured its resistance to judge its quality.
When the technician announced that the resistance was 200 ohms, everyone emphatically questioned, "Is that correct?" To explain, the rate of resistance changes completely with the way it is measured and depends on various conditions. But then the technician declared, "I can absolutely guarantee that it's 100 ohms or above. That we had achieved 100 ohms or above was fantastic. Nothing has made such a deep impression on me as that day." Everyone was cheering.
The crystals improved each day, and finally they completed a silicon with a resistance of 1,000 ohms. That greatly exceeded the standard value set in the United States.
We thought this was sufficient, so we went to the Ministry of International Trade and Industry with confidence and in high spirits. "We've done it," we told them. But MITI's reaction was a rebuff. They asked, "Is your method of measuring reliable?" They wouldn't believe us at all. Without checking, they said that it was useless to think about using this type of domestic product. We became angry. What a disgrace.
Going south on the freeway from San Francisco, vast plains gradually open on both sides of the road. This area is popularly known as Silicon Valley. There are roughly 4,800 firms here, everything from semiconductor makers to electrical equipment manufacturers. Silicon Valley, which has become the #1 electronics industrial area in the world, was at the end of the 1950s still filled with orchards. Here, in 1956, Dr. William Shockley, who discovered the junction transistor, recruited outstanding young people from throughout the United States and founded Shockley Transistor Laboratories. This was the first sprout that gave birth to today's Silicon Valley. These are the people, the best and brightest, who were selected by Dr. Shockley. They were the driving force that created the semiconductor industry. Among them was the late Robert Noyce, who is considered the father of the American semiconductor industry. This building is where Shockley had his lab. Today, it is an audio goods shop. The young people, inspired by Dr. Shockley, soon realized that he was not a good businessman, and they started looking for opportunities elsewhere. One group that left established Fairchild Semiconductor Corporation in 1957. An aerial camera equipment company of the same name put up the money. Led by Noyce, this group boldly experimented with new technologies. The first product they produced was the Mesa transistor. At the time, this was the leading edge of technology. IBM, which was deeply involved in military contracts, took notice of this new Fairchild technology. Initially, Fairchild's orders didn't exceed 100 pieces, but they gradually increased, and Fairchild began setting up a string of factories. Here's the process and structure of the Fairchild Mesa transistor. First, N-type silicon is prepared and placed inside a diffusion furnace and sealed. This liquid is a boron compound used as a p-type impurity. It is mixed with an inert gas and injected into the furnace. The ratio of boron gas forced in is carefully adjusted. This is because the thickness of the p-type layer that is made on top of the crystal surface varies according to the density of the gas and the heating time. When N-type silicon is heated in the boron gas, a p-type layer forms on the surface. Silicon with two layers, P and N, is then placed into an oxidation furnace and sealed. When water vapor is injected, the silicon inside the furnace joins with the oxygen in the air, and the surface becomes covered with a strong oxide film. This method was discovered by Carl Frosch and Lincoln Derrick. The thin purple layer is the oxide film. Beneath that is the p-type layer. The layer below is an N-type layer. A window is opened in the oxide film, and an N-type material is spread in again using the gas phase diffusion method. The method for opening windows is based on photographic technology. An adjacent window for later use is also opened. When a metallic film is added, the two windows become electrodes. The unneeded portions are then cut off, and a mesa shape similar to a plateau is completed. Now, using gas control, it becomes possible to finally build the p-type layer, and thus the transistor's characteristics improve dramatically. Fairchild achieved rapid growth after the company started mass-producing transistors for military use. But an unforeseen development threatened the company's future. Mesa transistors that were shipped started to fail in great numbers.
And it was traced fairly readily to the fact that when we were putting the can on it, we had a welder which was splashing some material all inside the can. And naturally, some of this material in the form of, we called it UFO, unidentified flying object, would fall on the material, and one would fall on that junction or on that junction and make a short.
Fairchild then came up with the planar transistor, in which the silicon was completely covered with an oxide film and fortified against contamination. This is the planar transistor developed by Gene Herney. Nothing protrudes from the silicon crystal surface except the necessary electrodes, making it contamination-proof. It was the planar technology called selective diffusion that combines oxide film, photoetching, and the gas phase diffusion of impurities. The planar transistor conquered the market, bringing Fairchild vast profits. Fairchild, which had almost been driven to the brink of bankruptcy by contamination that plagued the Mesa transistor, made rapid progress towards becoming a giant company. To make a planar transistor, an oxide film is placed on top of N-type silicon along with a photosensitive agent. A diagram of a window that is to be opened in the oxide film is placed on top and exposed to light. A window thus opens in the photosensitive film and the oxide film appears. When chemically treated, the oxide film melts and washes away, and the silicon appears. It is then placed in a furnace to diffuse impurities. A p-type boron compound circulates inside. As for the N-type silicon in the furnace, only the inside of the window changes into a p-type. The gray N-type layer is gradually transformed into a blue p-type layer. Another oxide film is added and a photosensitive agent applied on top. In order to open a small window, a diagram is placed on the top and exposed. A small window thus has opened on top of the P-type layer. Gas phase diffusion is again used to apply an N-type material. As for the P-type layer, only the inside of the window changes into an N-type. Everything is completely covered again with an oxide film. A photosensitive agent is applied, a diagram placed on top and exposed. When treated, an N-type layer protrudes from the middle, as does a P-type layer. An overall aluminum film is then added along with a photosensitive agent and diagrams of electrodes. It is then exposed. When treated, the unneeded portions rinse away and only the electrode portions remain. Only the necessary electrodes protrude, while everything else is covered with oxide film. This technology eventually led to the integrated circuit. Jack Kilby is 69 years old. In September of 1958, he created an integrated circuit.
As you looked at it, it became apparent that you could make any kind of component that you needed, with one exception, of silicon. You could certainly make transistors, you could make diodes, resistors, capacitors, other circuit elements.
This is Mr. Kilby's first integrated circuit, which has been donated to the Smithsonian Institution. This is an integrated circuit that Robert Noyce invented and mass-produced. The white lines seen on the surface are wires for connecting parts. These are connected to transistors and resistors, which were made one layer down and are encased in oxide film. Thus, a logic circuit for computer use was built into small silicon crystals. This was the debut of the orthodox integrated circuit. Two years before, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first man-made satellite. The United States desperately tried to catch up, but there was a clear difference in rocket technology. The Soviet Union, leaving behind it a stunned America, then launched a man into outer space. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
10 months behind the Soviet Union, the United States also placed an astronaut in orbit, but the rocket couldn't match the Vostok of the Soviet Union. Challenged by the technology of Sputnik, the West aimed at miniaturizing electronic equipment. G.W.A. Dumar of the British Royal Radar Establishment built small-scale circuits into silicon in 1957. The U.S. Army Signal Research and Development Laboratory and RCA technicians conceived micromodules. This was an idea designed to make the overall size of equipment smaller by making the major circuits that comprise the equipment into thin blocks, which would then be piled upon each other. Westinghouse technicians came up with the concept of molecular electronics. Although there was something resembling a model, it was not clear how to make it and with what structure.
In those days, we didn't say ICs. We called them solid circuits. We heard that they had been perfected, but the details were very sketchy. All we heard was that some circuit had been made inside a solid, and almost no other information.
A report saying that the first IC had been made for the first time appeared in the magazine Electronics. To tell you the truth, when I first read it, I didn't understand what they were talking about. We were going to treat the matter lightheartedly and overlook the whole thing. But Mr. Kikuchi remarked, "That's really odd. Could they be talking about some kind of new thing?" This made us think twice, and we started to tackle research on integrated circuits.
In the electrotechnical laboratory, the two researchers took on the test manufacturing of a solid-state circuit using independent technology. This is a technical memo written by Mitsubishi Electric Semiconductor Division in 1960. It mentions the molecular electronics conceived by Westinghouse. Mitsubishi Electric's president, who was excited by molecular electronics, issued an order for the independent development of the same technology, which was named the Molectron Project. However, at the time, Mitsubishi did not have planar technology. About the only thing it had was rudimentary technology for creating resistance in silicon using line etching. Technicians spread paraffin on the surface of silicon made into two layers, PN, and then scratched it with a pencil. When they later soaked it in etching fluid, the portion where the paraffin had come off displayed resistance, the resistance value being determined by the length of the scratch. In January of 1961, the electrotechnical lab team of Tarui and Denda completed a solid-state circuit with which they had been struggling. They built onto a germanium crystal chip an alloy transistor, a resistor, and a condenser, which were connected with wires and fixed with resin. That was the first Japanese integrated circuit. Following the work at the Electrotechnical Lab, Mitsubishi Electric unveiled several different test-manufactured molectrons.
We announced 11 kinds. The silicone was silicone, but at the time we couldn't use it for transistor technology. Therefore, in order to do so, we opened a hole in the silicone to insert a germanium transistor and buried it in there. In other words, the integrated circuit hadn't been formed molecularly. It was merely pasted in place. It was a fake. This led to problems, for we were asked by people like Mr. Denda, "How was your molectron made?" We were embarrassed and kept silent rather than reply.
This is the patent for the planar transistor. This was also the basic technology for integrated circuits. With this patent as a weapon, Robert Noyce of Fairchild asked the Ministry of International Trade and Industry to authorize his production of semiconductors in Japan.
Miti said no. On hearing this, Noyce came to my place and angrily said, "Nobody's as thick-headed as those guys at Japan's Miti." So then he decided to ask Nippon Electric to buy the planar patent.
Osafune and Noyce became friends on meeting at an academic conference. Mr. Osafune brought Noyce's conditions directly to the company's top officials, and they immediately bought the exclusive rights to the planar patent.
We took out an exclusive license. By doing that, it became impossible for even Fairchild to export to Japan. We were resented by all the other manufacturers. In particular, I think Hitachi was the most upset.
At the time, Hitachi was struggling with measures to prevent the degradation of MESA transistors. When broken open, it's possible to see the silicon crystals inside. The Hitachi staff tried to eliminate contamination by treating the surface of the completed transistor crystals later.
The technology that we used was to put a thin oxide film, such as quartz, onto the surface of the MESA transistor later. And in this way, we tried to protect the surface from water vapor and other impurities that might reach it.
The heat treatment after the transistors were completed had to be done at low temperature. Organic material of silicon oxide eventually turned into a gas. It was then circulated in the furnace, and the wafers were placed inside to see what would happen. The surface became covered with a silicon oxide film.
But making a film by dissolving an organic compound at such a low temperature is very different from making a film, such as quartz, at a high temperature. It becomes very rough and full of holes, so that water vapor ends up completely permeating everything through those holes. Since this method wasn't serving its purpose, we came to the point where we had to try something else.
This time, they added a metallic film to the top of the silicon oxide and placed it in a furnace to utilize the phenomenon in which two materials occasionally fuse when heated together at low temperature. They tried innumerable metal and silicon oxide combinations, but they couldn't create the desired metal.
But a young person who was working on my experiment with me, partly out of mischief, placed a few lead particles on a quartz plate and warmed them above a burner. When he did that, at very low temperature, the lead formed into drops and holes formed on the quartz plate, through which the lead trickled down.
Here's a reenactment of the experiment. A ball of lead is placed on a small dish of quartz glass. When placed over a flame, the lead gives off a white smoke and begins to burn. Before long, the quartz glass also begins to burn with the lead, and the bottom of the vessel melts like candy and falls out, demonstrating that when an orderly oxide film is made at low temperature with metal, it changes into a high-density film. It was factory technicians who first thought of using this method as a means of countering the planar patent. They decided to remove the oxide film and apply a new film to create a transistor based on low-temperature surface passivation technology. However, when it went into mass production, unimaginable difficulties awaited the technology, which had gone well during the test manufacturing stage.
In comparison to our problems, a stomachache was nothing. We couldn't make even one. The customers had been given a delivery date, and although we said we would supply 100,000 pieces per month, we just couldn't do it. This problem wasn't with only one company. Many companies had placed orders, and we were being criticized everywhere. We had pursued an independent path and had taken orders. But if you take orders and can't deliver, it's like having the whole world against you. Nobody supported us. But during this process, technicians were still reared. Business requires racking your brains over a problem and then somehow overcoming it. When such confidence is applied to the next difficulty, the good businessman will definitely see it through.
I think that the determination and hard work of the people who assumed leadership in the factories in those days is what gave birth to Japan's semiconductor industry. In other words, they exhibited tenacity in regard to perfecting domestic technology.
On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 took off. Destination, the moon. 4 days later, the astronauts climbed down and stood on the moon's surface. It was a brilliant achievement just 8 years after President Kennedy announced the goal of sending man to the moon. The greatest achievement was that the astronauts piloted Apollo 11 themselves on this round trip between the Earth and the moon.
copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Neil Armstrong reporting there. No difficulty adapting to the 1/6 gravity of the moon.
What made this all possible was an ultra-small guidance computer. The system was ordered by NASA from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in line with President Kennedy's objectives. Extremely low power consumption, extremely high reliability, and a system smaller than 1 cubic foot were the requirements. This is Apollo 11's ultra-small guidance computer. It is comprised of various modules separated according to function: warning, flight control, sensors, and logic. The surfaces of all of these are densely filled with ICs. There are 60 ICs per side on a module, 120 in all. A total of 550 transistors and 2,826 ICs were used in all of the devices. The power consumption was a mere 55 watts. In 1960, at the beginning of development, one IC cost $1,000. 4 years later, the cost had dropped to $25. And 12 years later, for Apollo 17, the price of an IC had become just $1. Due to American space development and national defense projects, the cost of ICs dropped dramatically, while performance improved markedly. Meanwhile, it was Japan that applied these results to civilian products. Japan developed consumer goods that incorporated large numbers of semiconductors, such as radios, televisions, and tape recorders. Then, from the late 60s through the 70s, the fierce calculator wars broke out. The competition prompted demand for vast quantities of ICs, spurring Japan's semiconductor industry to make even greater technological progress.